Welcome to Start with Hello, conversations about disability. In this episode, I am pulling in the big guns. Ryan Wolfe, President and Executive Director of Ability Ministry, joins me to talk specifics about a myth or perhaps misconception that we have heard frequently surrounding disability ministry. Okay, enough introductions. Let's get started. All right, so we've been kicking around the idea of covering what we have labeled as tales from consulting. And if I had a little bit more technical know-how, that would probably be treated like cinematically, like tales from consulting. What we want to do is we want to draw on questions or statements, things like that have come up from all your years of consultations. And I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that you've probably heard just about every single reason there is under the sun as to why a church does not have a disability ministry. In fact, I think if we're being honest, this Tales from Consulting thing could easily be a podcast just by itself. However, with this episode, we're going to tackle one statement in particular, and then I want to go into some details about what we have suggested to others whenever this statement has come up. And I think this one has come up several times, worded maybe differently, but the general premise is this. We don't have a disability ministry at our church because there aren't any people here with a disability. And right off the bat, to hear that, it could be easily overwhelming as to how you best answer that. And sometimes I'm not the best because I have a terminal case of sarcasm and foot and mouth. And unfortunately, what comes out of my mouth now is going to be filtered far better than what it would have been years ago. But I'm going to put you on the spot here, Ryan, and I'm going to ask you, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear someone say, well, we don't have a disability ministry at our church because there's nobody here with a disability?
Do hear that from time to time, and every time I hear it, it pretty much goes back to the fact that uh, people just need to be educated. They either don't have a proper view of what all is included in disability, um, or they're trying to. Sometimes I think churches are trying to kind of come up with an excuse as to why they don't need it. And it's just like the first thing comes to mind as well. I don't see anybody in my church that's using a wheelchair. So therefore, we don't have anybody with disabilities. And again, it goes back to, I think, education, improper views of disability. And I'll start right there with them. And um, oftentimes what I'll do is I'll just ask them for their zip code or what county they live in. So like while I'm talking to them, if this is over the phone or over Zoom, I'll be pulling up, different data so I can show them that there are in fact people in their community and in their church with a disability. So let's just kind of roll with that for a second. So if somebody would just say to me, well, we don't have anyone in our church with a disability because maybe they don't see somebody with a wheelchair. Let me throw a couple statistics out at you. If you were to go to the census website and pull up every American under the age of 65 that has a disability, you'd find that there are probably right around 42 million people in the United States that have a disability under the age of 65. And if you look at some other statistics, you'd find that under 4 million people, of that 42 million, probably use a wheelchair. So somewhere less than 10% of people are wheelchair users that have a disability. So, it could be that a pastor or somebody in their congregation says, well, I don't see anybody in a wheelchair. So therefore, we don't have anybody with disability. So they're only seeing, what has been, I think, branded as disability. And part of that is you look at the symbol for disability. Jason, what's the symbol for disability?
Oh, it's got to be a wheelchair. And in fact, I think as I've kind of dipped my toe into the waters of AI in the past, I think we've talked about this. It's like, okay, well, give me an image with disability. Always has a wheelchair.
Right,
And
right.
maybe even even our AI systems are biased a little bit towards that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, and I think sometimes, again, it's just education. People, they only think of disability in terms of wheelchair users, but, another statistic that I like to use with churches is the fact that you can't see 80% of disabilities with the naked eye. So, like, obviously, a wheelchair user, you can see that, somebody that maybe has Down syndrome, you can see that, but 80% of disabilities you can't see with the naked eye. And one of the next things that I will go to with a pastor or somebody that I'm talking to, and I would say pull up the most recent CDC statistics, and they would tell you that 1 in 4 adults in America have some form of disability. And again, a part of that's just educating people on what all is included in disability. So I would take them and I'd say, hey, uh, if you're looking out at your congregation when you're preaching, and maybe you got 100 people in your church. Again, another stat that I'll throw out to people here is that the Washington posted a kind of some research on how many people are in the average church in America. And this one kind of surprised me, but there are only 60 people in the average church in America as far as like church size goes. So maybe this is a pastor that's preaching to 60 people every Sunday morning. If you believe what the CDC says, that 1 in 4 adults have a disability, there'd be 15 people in that congregation of 60 that have a disability. And again, not all disabilities can be seen. Most 80% you can't see with the naked eye. So a lot of the things that I would do with a church would just be education, just trying to help them see how many people potentially are in their congregation already that are affected by disability, and what a huge opportunity that they actually have to reach out and make a difference.
I mean, when you first told me about this, I didn't, um I knew you weren't lying, obviously, but I don't think I fully understood the power of those numbers, and naturally, since I'm stubborn, I had to go look it up myself. So living here in Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, Jefferson County, I looked up the latest census numbers, and the population here, a little over 4.5 million. And if we took that 1 in 4, as in every 1 in 4 in the world is affected by a disability, we're looking at well over 1 million people affected by a disability here in Kentucky. And then I dove a little further and I looked at our county and found that in our county alone, the population is a little over 780,000. And one fourth of that would be 195,000. And I think about those. And I think if you're an advocate in your church or organization, these are cool numbers to have in your back pocket to look them up. I keep these stored on my phone because it kind of staggers people a little bit when they hear about it. And it goes back. I don't know if you remember telling me this, but it might have come this might have been another one of your tales from consulting, but I remember somebody kind of pushing back on you, and they would have said, "Oh, 195,000 people or 782,000 people. There's no way our church is going to reach all of that." And I think your answer was, "Okay, great. What do you think it would be reasonable instead to try to reach 1% of that? Surely your church could try to reach 1%. That sounds very minimal. But if you're looking at Jefferson County where I live, you're talking about if you did that, that's an influx of 2,000 people on the weekend. Now, if your church is averaging 60 people, what pastor wouldn't want an influx of 2,000 people that show up because they're not coming alone, they're coming with family members. But this whole thing, it just makes me wonder as I'm driving around, I think about that there's nearly 2,000 people in this county who who are affected by disability but don't have any place to go. And I think about that question of, well, there's nobody here. That's why we don't have a disability ministry. And it's like, well, maybe there's nothing for them to come to, which is why they're not there. So knowing how many people in the community that you have the opportunity to reach is great. But obviously that alone doesn't get people just to show up to church. In fact, we've talked about this a lot, and there's a lot of training exercises that you've done have really been eye opening for me that says what your building says about your ministries speak louder than you might realize. So, could you walk us through just a little bit about the first impressions resource that we developed and why you recommend that everyone use this as they create a disability ministry?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is again, you've grabbed the pastor or the leader's attention. You've given them some statistics. You've piqued their interest. Maybe you've corrected some of their incorrect thinking about what all's included in disability. And at that point, they're kind of like flabbergasted. They're like, "Oh my gosh, we have people with disabilities in our church, and oh my gosh, we have hundreds or thousands, like you mentioned in your community, of people with disabilities." And uh the lights gone on for the pastor, and it's kind of a moment of panic. They're like, oh my gosh, what do I need to do? And you mentioned the first impressions resource, but before we get to the first impressions resource, I generally start with the accessibility checklist. And I feel like that's kind of where it begins. And you mentioned, the building sometimes speaks for you, and every church and their campus, and I say campus more than I say building, because when you pull into a parking lot, whether you see signage or not, whether you see enough handicap parking spaces or not, whether you see a curb cut that allows a wheelchair to get up over a sidewalk or not, whether you see some automatic doors that open or not, uh, all those things communicate something about your church and how you feel about people with disabilities. And for most pastors that don't live with disability or don't have a loved one with disability, you don't necessarily think about these things. It doesn't naturally, come to mind like I should be thinking about these things. So that's why we created the accessibility checklist, and it goes from parking, like I said, the parking lot to the entrance of the building, to the signage, to the worship center, to the restrooms, classrooms, and other areas of the church. It is a great exercise, and I just encourage staff to go through it together. The checklist is super simple. You're literally checking yes or no. The different parts of your campus are accessible, and it has a notes section, so you can make notes on. Okay, this is something we need to correct. We need to prioritize this over this, because if you don't address some of those accessibility issues, you may never have a chance to make a first impression, because your building's already done it for you, and you don't want your building or your campus to communicate a message that doesn't line up with your heart. Because I think if you asked every pastor in the U.S. in the world, uh, do you love all people? I'd be willing to bet that maybe I'm naive here. I'd be willing to bet that 99% of them would say, "Absolutely, we love all people. We want all people to come to our church, and that includes people with disabilities." But if you haven't marked off some of these things on your checklist, somebody might pull into your parking lot and pull out, and you may never even know it, because they take one look and see that it's not accessible, and they think, "Why is it worth my time to even go in there?" If they haven't addressed things in the parking lot, or at the front door, or signage, different things like that. So yeah, I think the checklist, the accessibility checklist, is awesome. And then kind of a next step from that is the first impressions resource that we have. Again, it works as a checklist, and that deals with things like volunteers, website, different areas that you can go above and beyond in, so you can have that perfect first impression for people affected by disabilities. Because you do need to do some work to be prepared for that, for the people that have yet to come. But you also, again, need to address some of these issues for the people that are already there, because 25% of your congregation are affected by disabilities. Addressing some of these issues could go a long way into communicating just how much you value them and how much you want their experience to be one that's welcoming, and that it just shows that you do know and that you do care.
Do you remember? I can't even remember what year this was, but we were doing I wanna say that this was one that we had one of the indispensable conferences that we hosted. It might not have been, so I hope you'll correct me when I'm wrong here, but there was a couple scenarios, that you allowed those in attendance to do, and one of the exercises in particular was someone's task was to use a wheelchair and only a wheelchair, and you gave them the assignment of and it sounded really simple when you said it, and you said, "Hey, all you've gotta do is use this wheelchair and go to the restroom and wash your hands, and then come back and tell us how it went." And in my mind, I thought, "Well, great, like, you gave this guy the easy assignment." But I don't think he I don't think he had the experience that he was expecting. Do you remember that story?
Yeah, I've done this exercise several different, trainings at churches and conferences and different things, but, the story that I think you're referring to, is at a training that I did at a church, and, the person that I picked for this, was the executive pastor at the church, and I didn't know he was the executive pastor when I picked him. But I said just that. I said, "Hey, your task is, you know, get in this wheelchair, go wash your hands, come back. Let us know how it went." And you've got the rest of the staff that's in this training, and they're just watching. And you could tell he was fish out of water. He'd never been in a wheelchair before, never helped anybody with a wheelchair before, so he didn't know how to, he did not know how to unlock the wheels, and then, struggling to open a door and get himself out the door, and then he was gone, and then he legitimately was gone for quite a while. So I went into another experience during that training, and eventually he comes back in the door, and I said, "Hey, how was your experience?" And he was absolutely destroyed. And I didn't know, exactly how his experience would be, but, he couldn't reach, the way the sinks in their bathrooms were, he couldn't reach the soap dispenser, which was up higher than, uh, than where he was seated. So, he could get to the edge of the sink, but he couldn't reach the soap, and then he couldn't reach the paper towels either. So, like, couldn't even wash his hands. So, again, if you or a loved one affected by disabilities, gotta use the restroom, you wanna wash your hands, hopefully everybody wants to wash their hands, uh, couldn't do it. And it was all because of the way the bathroom was designed. He couldn't reach the soap, couldn't reach the paper towels, and he just came back. He was like, "Oh my gosh, we've got a lot of work to do because we want our, building, our bathrooms, and everything to communicate that we have thought about people with disabilities, that we care about people with disabilities." And that's why, I handed them the accessibility checklist and said, "Hey, you go through this checklist and it'll address all of those issues." So yeah, again, I don't think pastors don't care. Um, Again, I'd be willing to bet 99% of pastors care. It's just that they're unaware because they don't live in the world of disability. And I think once you build that awareness with them, most of them will say, "Hey, this is going to become a priority for us to work on addressing some of these accessibility issues." It may not be something that we can tackle, in 1 year because, making renovations to bathrooms, different things like that sometimes cost more than, a church of 60 or 100 or 200 people have the budget for. So they may have to stage, some of these corrections. But once you're aware of it and you've got a plan to address it, and you can communicate to people that, "Hey, we know this is an issue. We're working on addressing it." One of the things that I think, can and will happen in a lot of churches is once you communicate that you have a plan for it, people will jump in to help. Maybe the church doesn't have the budget dollars to address it all at once, but maybe somebody in the congregation is passionate about it, or maybe somebody in the congregation is, involved in construction or plumbing or something like that, and they'll say, "Hey, let me volunteer my time. Let's knock off this checklist, and let's make sure that we're accessible for everybody."
I mean, I think that's a good way at some point for a church to get their men's ministry involved into doing something like that. And we haven't even touched the topic of the universal sized changing tables, which we'll have to get in at some point. But while you were talking, I couldn't help but think back to that story and think I remember you had asked the guy, "Well, what does this communicate to you?" And he says it communicates to people that we haven't thought about everybody. And like you said, it goes back to education. And what I have learned is that the disability community is a very tight knit community. There's a lot of communication between them. And if you might have all the great intentions in the world, but if you don't think about everybody, I can imagine that word also being spread around. Somebody may show up to your church and like, well, I really love the pastor, but we can't do something basic like use the restroom or wash our hands. And that could be something that you could easily avoid by going through these checklists and things and all these tools that we've put together to kind of help the education process of it. But for sake of argument, the let's say the person in the consultation who said, "We don't have a disability ministry at our church because there aren't any people here with a disability." Let's say they did their community study. They've gone through all the numbers. They've walked through their campus. They've used all of our checklists. They're thinking through these first impressions. They may even have a couple volunteers and everybody's gung ho. They're excited. But for some reason or another, the church leadership themselves isn't entirely on board with the whole thing. Now what?
Well, this is definitely something, that I run to routinely with people, and this happens because, and I'm gonna ballpark this, but, I'm gonna say, somewhere between 75 and maybe 90% of disability ministries are probably started by a passionate mom, a mom that has a child with a disability. Uh, she recognizes the fact that the church has a lot of shortfalls when it comes to, maybe not only being accessible, welcoming, and having volunteers that kind of know what to do with her child. So it's usually a passionate mom that takes kind of the bull by the horns and gets things started. And she only gets so far, and then she gets frustrated, and that's usually where these moms will reach out, or people will reach out and say, "Hey, I've got a child with a disability. I've done what I can do, but I know there's so much more that the church could do if they catch the vision for this. I know that there are other kids like my child that would benefit from this. Please help." That's kind of where a lot of my consultations will start. And so I walk them through kind of the process, and I help them to do kind of the hard work of gathering the data, who in the community has a disability. Walk them through doing the checklist, so they can see where things need to be addressed by the church, whether it be accessibility, whether it be attitudes, whether it be education, whether it be you know what does the Bible say about disability. So we've done all of the kind of first few steps in starting disability ministry, but the fact of the matter is, disability ministries will only grow as much as the leadership of the church is bought into it. So at some point in time, the passionate mom that's got frustrated has come to us, needs help to put together a compelling presentation that she can take to the leadership of the church, and we have this resource that's called "Why Start Disability Ministry," and it does for people what I think. Um, Needs to be done, because I think pastors, being a pastor in a local church myself, for over 15 years, pastors, they value different things. A lot of times they value numbers, because so much of their job is dependent on numbers. Okay, how many people do we have in attendance? How large is the offering? Uh, so they value numbers. So this resource, why I started disability ministry, uh, gathers a lot of those numbers that pastors are passionate about. And what I love about this resource is, we made it for the people that uh, may not be real savvy with putting together a presentation. So we've done that for them. This resource comes with a free presentation, laid out in PowerPoint. It comes with handouts, and literally all you have to do is take some of that homework, some of those numbers that you've done, uh, plug them into the presentation. You can customize it, and then you're ready to go. You just literally call up the pastor and say, "Hey, I'd love to meet with you and certain staff members. I'd love to go over with you a presentation I put together that is going to tell you why our church should start a disability ministry." And again, like I said, it's super professional. PowerPoint slides, handouts, everything's customizable. And I think any pastor that sits through a meeting where somebody is going through this resource at the end of the meeting, there is no way the pastor can say, "Well, no, our church shouldn't do this." And if they do say that, I think that's a very telling, and that's one of those situations where you see in the Bible where Jesus tells his disciples, "Shake the dust off your feet and move along to the next town." So if a pastor goes through and sits through that presentation and says, "Nah, I don't think this is for us. Time to find a new church." So yeah, that resource is super super valuable. And did I mention it's free?
which really is gonna fit every single person's budget. I know we joke around a lot about that, but we do really try to put a lot of emphasis on creating tools and things that are free because we know that, a lot of people, like you said, it might be a mom who's just really passionate about this, and now she finds herself probably in more of a leadership position than she once realized, and now the realization hits in of like, okay, we've got to put a price tag on some of these. If we have to renovate the bathrooms, or is there something else that we could do to make that? So a lot of these things that we created for free are definitely intentionally done. So I would say that if you've made it in this process so far, and you've gone through the studies, you've gone through the numbers, you've gone through the checklist, you've sat down with your pastor, and because the truth is, we can tell the pastors all day long, "Hey, this is something you should do." And it's not like we're lying, but I think it carries a greater impact when a parent or a caregiver sits down and says, "Look, we love this church, but we really need this as well." I think that carries a little bit more weight. But so let's say that you've got the community info, you've reviewed your campus, you have some volunteers in place, but now you actually have to do it. And I think there's so many misconceptions around disability ministry that I found, and it's not something that you can just go get a degree in. And I haven't found a lot of online training where you can go take a class that prepares you. One of the things that really uh, makes you learn very quickly is there is no crash course on all the different diagnoses, and there's no. I don't feel like that. Looking back, I don't feel like I could have ever been truly prepared and comfortable saying, "Okay, I know no matter what happens today, I'm fully prepared for it." But volunteers do want to feel some kind of prepared, right? And I think maybe if it's a ministry that's volunteer led or it's staff, however that's handled, I think they want to give their volunteers some type of training. So, how do you prepare volunteers? And I think more importantly, how do you make sure that what they're doing is rooted in scripture?
That's a great question. And again, whether this is from the perspective of this is a pastor that says we don't have anybody with disability, and you've done some of that education and you've kind of walked him, through some steps, or whether this is the passionate parent that has gotten stuff started, finally got the attention of the leadership, and they said, "Okay, I get it. Here's the green light. Go ahead and start." So either path that you're going down, as far as like getting started, the first thing you got to do is build a volunteer team, because disability ministry is not a Superman ministry, where one person does it all. If it's one person doing it all, it's not going to last very long. So key to your success is going to be multiplying yourself, building up your team of volunteers. But you got to feed those volunteers. You got to prepare those volunteers. If serving in disability ministry is something that's foreign to them, which it is to many people, you're going to have to give them something that makes them feel like, okay. I can do this. And that's why again we've created so many free materials for churches to use. One of the things that I'd like to highlight here is our volunteer 101 resource. So if you go to our store, you can search for free stuff, which is cool. It's probably my favorite section in our store. And you'll find a volunteer 101 training series that you can download. It is a video driven series that comes with an entire package of principles that you can print off, and so you can go through. I think it's like 3 sessions, uh, 3 video sessions, and each session comes with printables. So you can walk your volunteers through a very basic 101 level training, helping them to get prepared for starting in disability ministry. One of those, you said, how do we do this? Make sure it's rooted in scriptures, um, and what like the Bible says about disability. So one of the very first resources that you would download and hand to your volunteers before maybe the first video is a resource called "What Does the Bible Say About Disability?" And that'd be something that you're going to study together as part of this training, because you do want to make sure you're starting off with the right perspective. What God believes about disability is what your volunteers should believe about disability, and that should add fuel to what you do, give you purpose. It's super, super important. And I'm not kidding, Jason. I think in this package, if people were to download this, they'd probably get upwards of 20 to 30 free printable resources that every disability ministry needs. So not only are you getting things that will help your volunteers feel ready and comfortable when it's time, to go for the first time, but it's also going to help the ministry leader know that they've got what they need when it comes to like forms and packages uh, that they need to use and to have. So yeah, the volunteer 101 is a must have for anybody that's starting off or anybody that's kind of onboarding new volunteers. It's a great way to start because again, not everybody feels like an expert, and you don't have to be an expert to be successful in disability ministry. You just have to know what materials are out there and how to access them and how to use them. So definitely that's something that people need if they're getting started.
I think the that should be really comforting to anybody listening that says you don't have to be an expert. And if you want living proof of that, come visit me at church anytime that I'm teaching because you, you're like, well, if this guy, if this guy can do it, then there is hope for me because there's jokingly, I mean, we joke around that, but there's a lot of truth to this. There's a lot of resources on the website that I have reached out to Ryan in a panic and said, okay, this happened, what would you do? And then we figured out, well, if I needed it, then surely somebody else will need it. So there's a lot of free resources like that. So if you find something useful, there the chances are that it was because I tripped up on it, and we needed to avoid that in the future. But I mean, you could see why this is kind of overwhelming to a lot of people. You know, you're talking census numbers and presenting it to the leadership, and now we've got to evaluate our building and first impressions, and there's a whole lot of things that go into it. And one of the things that I think might trip people up is just this order or the sheer volume of information. And I know that we do a lot of consultations, so I wanted you to talk just briefly about the consultations, how much they cost, and why do you think it's important to even bother with that?
Yeah, yeah. Again, I think it comes back to the fact that a lot of us in disability ministry feel like we're alone. Again, it's not a Lone Ranger ministry, but as a disability ministry leader, you may be the only leader literally in your county or the next 3 counties over. So you may not have somebody that you can lean on and say, "Hey, help walk me through this. I've not encountered this before," and there's so many reasons why people should take advantage of our consulting services. One of the biggest reasons is again the cost. It's free, like almost all of our other resources that we have available. I like,
But it's only free for the first hour, like, after once you go beyond the first hour, what is it, like $1,000 an hour? Is that what you've been charging?
No, 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 it's actually free after the first hour as well. So,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
it's I joke with people and I say, "Hey, we have a really bad business model, because we have a really big kingdom here." And I don't believe in charging for consultation because I think that becomes an obstacle for churches. Another reason why not to do disability ministry, because again, it can feel like a Lone Ranger ministry. It can feel like you're off on your own. We want to be there for churches when they run into a problem. So sometimes consultations or just troubleshooting a single problem, and that's it. That's the only conversation we ever have. People move forward, and that's fine. Most of the time, our consultations are with churches that are getting started. They're in the very beginning stages, and they're not even sure what to do. So those consultations, those may be several conversations that happen, whether it be by phone call, by Zoom, by email. Um, so that's probably where we see most of our consultations. Others are just reaching out looking for resources, maybe need help using those resources. So there's a lot of different reasons why people reach out to us for our consulting services. We have a handful of people on our team that handle those kind of based on what people want. So if you reach out, you could get me, you could get Jason, you could get Bronwyn, you could get Rana based on what people need. But yeah, bad business model, big kingdom heart. We believe in free because we know churches don't have big budgets for disability ministry. So we want to get people the help they need any way we can.
Going back, I wanted to backtrack just a little bit. I'm gonna put you on the spot here. Just kind of a question I wanted to throw at you when you're talking about first impressions or just getting the ministry started. You got volunteers, maybe you've got leadership buy-in, you've gone through consulting, and now you've got to set up your space. What is the average disability ministry classroom look like?
I would say that there's not necessarily a standard classroom, and that's one of the things I love. I think about disability ministry. A lot of churches will start their disability ministry within their children's ministry. So it might be that they start with a buddy system within the regular children's classrooms. It might be that they have a sensory room. A lot of churches will create a sensory room. And that's something that we have training materials for that we can share with churches. So it might be a sensory room. There are some churches that start with an adult classroom, and that may look like a small group, may look like a Sunday school class, it may look like a church service of their own. So there are just so many different ways that churches get started that there's no necessarily cookie cutter way. Every church is unique based on where they're located, who's already there. We already mentioned that, every church has people with disabilities. So you start with who you have, and that kind of becomes the starting blocks for you, whether you're starting with children, adults, with teens, whether you're doing inclusion, like full inclusion, whether you're working towards inclusion, whether you're in a sensory room, whether it's just, there are so many different on ramps to starting a disability ministry. So spaces are determined on who you have as you get started.
And I think that's a good point, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring it up because I think sometimes we can get online and we can get on Facebook and you could see some really extravagant rooms and setups, and you're thinking, "There's no way we'll ever do that." And I could see how that might be discouraging. But on the flip side, I remember a conversation that I had actually with my mom, and they did not have a disability ministry. And I remember she had called to tell me that they had a family that was coming. They had a young man who was on the autism spectrum and loved music, and she was just kind of just wanting some general advice, things that she could do. And in the middle of this, it just hit me. I thought, hey, now congratulations. You have a disability ministry right now, right there in whatever room you're meeting in. That's exactly what your disability ministry should look like. And I think sometimes we kind of overlook that sometimes, that we got to have all these fancy bells and whistles. Yeah, obviously the more that you can make it accessible, the more that you can be prepared. The more that you can talk leadership into giving you a bigger budget, obviously all of these those things will help, but just having one person there, that's the start for your disability ministry. And because I remember that at my church when we reopened after COVID, we had this huge 5,000 square foot space just for disabilities. And I remember feeling there was a little overwhelming feeling happening there. And there's so many moving parts. And I'm curious, what advice would you have for somebody who they might feel like, okay, I definitely feel God is calling me to do this. Like there's no doubt in my mind this is where I should be. However, I don't have a lot of resources and leadership. Yeah, they're kind of behind, but maybe they're kind of not. Maybe they're kind of standing on the sidelines and like waiting for us to score a few touchdowns before they start cheering really loud. Maybe you don't have an adequate number of volunteers. There's no support from the pulpit. So what advice would you have for somebody like that who knows they feel that calling, but they might not feel that there's a lot of people coming around them to help?
Yeah, you know, through consultations, through trainings we've done, with resources we've shared, we've helped churches anywhere from 20 people in a no stoplight town in Texas, uh, to well over 20,000 people, in towns of several million people. So there is no there is no one way you have to do it. Like you mentioned, if you have one person, you have a disability ministry. One of the most encouraging things that and cool things I think we've ever heard, when we heard from a person that was buying our curriculum, uh, and she said, "We only have one person in our disability ministry." So here's someone who's buying our curriculum, using our curriculum, teaching our lessons, and they only have one person. Um, so if you have one person, if you've identified one person, you can have a disability ministry. You don't have to be like the big church down the road. That's okay. Every church is different. A bit of advice that I give every church, whether they're a church of 20 or 20,000, is that disability ministry is more like a crock pot than a microwave. It takes time. If you want to do it right, um, a lot of times it takes time, and that's okay. Things that you eat out of a crock pot always taste better than things that you eat out of a microwave because it's taken time to cook properly. And another thing that I always encourage people, regardless of the size of church or resources, is start small and move slowly. Again, kind of that crock pot philosophy. You start with who you have. Some of the exercises that we do, we identify people within the congregation that have a disability, and then we identify people outside the congregation that have a disability that don't come to church yet. You always start with who you have. Make the mistakes with the people that you have already, because they'll forgive you when you mess up, because you will mess up. They're already there because they love you and they believe in you. So start small with them. Develop a 6 month or a 12-month plan where all you do is work with the people that you already have before you roll out the red carpet to your community, before you make the announcement that you have a disability ministry, before you add it to your website. Start small, start with who you have, make the mistakes with them, uh, so you are ready for your community when that time comes. But yeah, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So take your time.
It reminds me of a conversation that I had at my church. And, I attend Southeast Christian Church. And if anybody knows that church, they'll tell you it's huge. I think by just any standards, it's multi-campus. There's a lot, there's a lot of people that attend there. And I remember after we opened after COVID, I can't even remember how many months had gone by in our teen class. And it was on a routine basis where we may have had one, two students, but we had 5 or 6 volunteers, and we're all just sitting around for just, like, maybe 1 or 2 people, and it kinda frustrated me. I thought, "Look, we've got this huge brand new space. We've got this massive church. Where are the people at? Why did we build this? Like, where are they at?" And then ironically, the first time you saw it, your thought was, "Well, this is too small." You're like, "Based on your population, you're gonna need" it's kinda like Jaws, "We're gonna need a bigger boat." But I remember having this conversation with one of the staff who oversees all of the disability ministry, and just kind of voicing that frustration. And because I know numbers are important, you don't want to build this massive thing and then to see it not be in use. But that crock pot analogy, the marathon analogy, is so appropriate because this is a huge church. And the minute they opened the doors, they didn't see this massive influx of people. It took some time, and it takes staff and leadership that also understand that, because I remember I was asking her, what's going on? Like, you can't tell me we don't have more teenagers affected by disability that want to come to church. Like, this is crazy. There's even signage on the outside of the building, the only ministry at the church that has that. And I was so frustrated. And she just smiled and she looked at me and she said, one at a time. And I just, it kind of stopped me in my tracks that she had the presence of mind and the faith greater than me to say that. But she knew, okay, we're going to focus on the people that come. The rest is going to take care of itself. And she's like, we're trusting God that we've built this space and we're going to keep reaching our friends with disabilities. And fast forward, and now that there's times where there's standing room only in that room. And I have to admit, there's days where I'm like, why did everybody show up today? This is going to be challenging. Can we have a day where there's like one, or, of course, obviously I would never wish that. I want the place to be overflowing. That's my thing. But, your comment about it being a crock pot thing, I think having that patience and understand it's going to take some time, helping leadership understand that, hey, we're going to put some money into this, but it is going to take some time. But once it happens, it's happens, and you don't really think that you can stop it once you make that effort. But anyway, Ryan, I want to say thanks for hopping on and taking time out of your $1,000 an hour consultations. Just kidding. Um, I should say it's a text. If you text Ryan, it's $1,000 per text. I'm just kidding.
Only if it comes after 5 p.m. Eastern.
Yeah, 5 PM. Yeah, y'all remember we're on the East Coast now. So if you're like, well, I didn't get a response. Well, now you know why. But thanks for hopping on and helping work through a couple of these questions. We're really just kind of scratching the surface here. We've got a whole lot more to cover in the later episodes. We've kicked around a pretty good schedule of content that we're going to release that we hope and pray is going to be helpful for you. For example, in the next episode, we're going to go a little bit deeper dive into preparing volunteers for disability ministry. So make sure you subscribe on your platform of choice, or stay tuned to social media for the latest updates. Thanks.
One in 5 people in the world live with a disability, so it shouldn't be difficult to find lots of images to represent this. However, that's not always the case. Disability is Beautiful provides an exhaustive library of art provided by and for the disability community. Our photos reflect the beauty, diversity, and strength of the disability community. Whether you're a business owner, a content creator, or an advocate, Disability is Beautiful has photos for use in blogs, websites, social media, printed materials, business, nonprofit, or personal projects. Visit disabilityisbeautiful.com to create your free account and help us change the face of stock photography.